Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. Once again, I'm Drew with my colleague and friend here, Alex. This week, we're going to be discussing something that perhaps you haven't thought about in a few years, which is the Keystone XL Pipeline. Recently, it just made small headlines that a recent leak that started in October is actually 10 times more dangerous than what they originally had thought. Though we'll get into the exact details and see why that headline is a little bit misleading. But what we're going to discuss basically what this pipeline is, a little bit of history of that, and what this means for different issues, including environmental and indigenous rights. So, with all that, let's dive right into it. Yeah, it's interesting to have this come up again. This was a hot button issue probably, 4 or 5 years ago. And it led to a lot of protests and very publicized protests and headlines. And it was pretty big news for a while. But basically, long story short, is from Canada to down to the Gulf of Mexico. TransCanada, which is a Canadian energy company, an oil company, they wanted to build a pipeline going across the United States and picking up pipelines from the U.S. Midwest and moving the oil to the south so it could be exported out from the Gulf of Mexico. And it's caused a lot of political, environmental, and cultural questions and issues that have made headlines.
It's a great way to put it, Drew. Yeah. Hope everything's going well. Yeah, it's an interesting topic to get into the news again because I think it was 2014, 2015 when all the protests were happening. I think so. Yeah, I think it was 2014. And since then, it hasn't really been covered too much. It kind of came back into the news in 2017 when Trump, passed the legislation to go ahead, which Obama had been, as you know, stalling during his presidency.
Right.
But as we know, Trump's very pro oil companies and big business, and so this obviously fits in the mold with the rest of the things he usually would decide on. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of go back a little bit and just kind of refresh everyone or educate everyone on what this pipeline was doing and why it was, I guess, somewhat different in form of the other oil we were getting. And basically, the pipeline was going to move tar sands from Alberta down and into the United States. And tar sands are a little bit controversial because these sands contain bitumen, a gooey type of petroleum that can be converted into fuel. But it's actually very difficult to extract this oil from the tar sands. And so it's very inefficient and very dirty and very flammable. And so though it can be obviously converted easily into petroleum, it's not one of the ideal ways to do it. But a lot of people say that it's helped the U.S. and Canada have a huge fossil fuel boom in the last couple of years. And it has helped us somewhat weed off of Saudi oil and other Arab Gulf countries' oil. So it is interesting to think that in some ways it has made us more, self-efficient, but it's very controversial.
Yeah, and so that's definitely one of the environmental aspects is the fact that it's tar sands oil and not like your average, oil drill. And so that's definitely that's a point of contention as well. And then I think on other environmental issues include like the risk of leakages in sensitive areas, and that's what brought this back into headlines recently. I guess that there was a leak that started in October, and this leak was originally looked at to be only a few acres. But the leak was only affecting a few acres, and then I guess now they think it's going to be a lot more. So let me just confirm with that. But I think it's still only within the realm of like 5 to 10 acres. So they say it's like 200,000 square feet, which is a lot, but it's not like a massive leak. Like we're not talking like a BP oil leak in the Gulf we had 10 years ago, where that was millions and millions and millions of barrels. It looks like they're losing about 5,000 barrels in this leak, which is no joke. But and it was confirmed, at least from the news we have so far, that it's not affecting any water sources. But I still think it's not a huge spill. And it's not affecting any water sources, but it's still I think worth discussing what is the potential of larger spills, and what happens if they do affect water supplies and stuff like that. So, so when you see the headline, the Keystone Pipeline, this is from The Hill, Keystone Pipeline still affecting nearly 10 times more land than first thought. It does sound like a huge issue.
Hmm.
I just think it's important to clarify to people that, like, make sure don't just read the headline, read the article, because it looks like it was supposed to impact 22,000 square feet. And then instead it's impacted 209,100 square feet, which is 4.8 acres.
Right.
And I don't think there's any more risk from this specific leak. Yeah. Okay. So 81. Yeah. 80, yeah. Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's worth talking about, but we just got to be. I think everyone has to be careful when you're reading headlines to look at the actual details.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because I think that if you just look and say, oh, 10 times bigger than expected, you're like, damn, this sounds pretty controversial and dangerous. But I mean, I would argue that I think it's less the size of the spill, but the frequency that has made this pipeline so controversial,
Yes, I think it's a good point.
because yeah, just because since it's been opened and in use, there have been way more spills than they accounted for. And I actually wanted to draw our attention to this Reuters article from last year, I think it was, where they're basically talking about how there seemed like there was some kind of negligence and foul play by this Trans Canada company in 2007, because basically the permit that they were given, um, it basically allowed them to use higher pressure than standard, and so it was controversial. And basically they lied and said that it'd be safer and there would be only like one or two leaks a year. And in quotes, it said not more than once every 7 to 11 years. And so on this parameter, they were able to get this permit saying that it would not ever leak. It'd be safer. And now they actually are, Reuters is reporting that they actually might lose this permit. And that could be, I don't know, it could be very controversial for the pipeline itself. But it just seems like this company from the beginning sort of wasn't true about what they were actually getting out of it in some ways. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they're trying to bend the rules a little bit so that they can get something approved.
Yeah.
And that's I feel like we see that all the time when you have massive corporations. I mean, look at Boeing with their AI stuff that they said, oh no, it's fine, it's totally fine. There's no, but then there's no fail safe, and then their systems led to people dying, and it turned out because they wanted to just quickly get through checks so they can get the plane out. So it's like, we see this time and time again with large corporations. I mean, just human nature in general. If we find
Yeah.
a way to cut a corner, some people in this world will cut the corner and some people won't. But we're seeing that, pipelines companies are now cutting corners. There was a leak a few years ago from a welding error. You're right that it's more about the frequency. And, again, this current one that we're seeing doesn't affect a water source, but what if the one in the future does? And then now you're affecting not just, the nature, but perhaps humans down the water system. And that also brings me
Right.
to the next point is the indigenous rights and like the rights of Native Americans and in Canada, First Peoples, um, is is some of this stuff, especially when the XL pipeline proposed to go through parts of North and South Dakota, can affect the lands of the native peoples there, not just in the ways of health, but like first of all in health ways, there's a contention that it can affect water sources as well as local fish resources that some of these native peoples rely on. And then on top of that, more of the cultural aspect is that it can affect like sacred lands, and it would utilize and basically endanger like cultural and sacred held places. So for someone like me that doesn't really like have a full understanding of like what's sacred land, like there's nothing in my personal culture that has like, oh, like a sacred land or something. I think it's hard. I think a lot of people are like that, where it's kind of hard to understand and interpret what that kind of means. I think a lot of people's idea of what sacred lands is like something from like a Disney movie.
Hmm.
So I don't know, it's like something you really hold dear to your heart, and that's of super cultural importance. Kind of like when the Notre Dame was burning in Paris, France, people were really worried because it was like, this is a massive cultural symbol, right? It's something that resembles something sacred to humanity. Well, even though it's man-made, I think that that kind of feeling can be applied to some sacred lands in the Midwest to the native peoples, where it's like, if you build a pipeline through this, it's basically like burning their Notre Dame. And I don't know, it's a really interesting point, and I think that Native Americans in the United States definitely get kind of a back seat to political discussions, and we've seen that time and time and again in history with the breaking of treaties over and over. That they don't really get a full say in the decisions that happen in this area, even when they're lied to that they are.
That's very well said, and I think you drew a really good comparison between sacred land and the idea of a Notre Dame, or maybe the Amazon as well. Because when the Amazon was burning, you had everyone all over the world on social media, and obviously not making a direct impact on stopping anything, but you saw this emotional response from people from all over the world, and I think you're right with these sacred lands in the Midwest and other parts. I mean, I think the issue is we just don't have a good understanding of Native American culture, and it's because, like you said, they've always been in the back seat, and so I think it's hard for a lot of Americans to understand this issue, I think it was in 2014 and 2015, you had all these Lakota Sioux and other Native American groups out protesting, and I think for a lot of people, it's just an issue they either don't know about or don't connect with, because unfortunately our education system and just the way we've run our country since day one hasn't been supportive of Native American rights or cultural heritage. And, it's a shame. It's a shame. And it's actually, it's ironic. We have Thanksgiving coming up, and everyone thinks of Thanksgiving, as being the day where the Pilgrims and the Native Americans sat down to be one and share harvest and survive the winter. But I was reading a CNN article this morning that was talking about how for most Native Americans, they call it the National Day of Mourning, Thanksgiving, because since the first Thanksgiving in the 1600s, not much has changed, and we're still seeing just Native Americans not having any really say in what happens to the land they were on first, and so it's just kind of interesting that we're coming into Thanksgiving again, and we still just have such a division and difference amongst Native Americans. I don't think, if you asked a random person on the street what they thought sacred land was for Native Americans, I don't think they would probably have any opinion or say on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I honestly don't think most people even realize that there are Native Americans with sovereign land living in the United States that have signed treaties with the U.S. government. Like, I don't think people realize that. It's like so. It's an afterthought. It's I only saw them in the movies, right? The cowboys and Indian movies, and it's like, the reality is very different. And so today, now that we bring that up, it is interesting to see that Native American tribes filed a lawsuit seeking to invalidate the Keystone XL pipeline. So we mentioned it a little bit earlier, right? So this whole issue became a political pinpoint during the Obama administration. It's so much so that Obama decided to stall the permit to build the XL part of the pipeline. Now, again, the Keystone Pipeline is already built in like 4 different stages. And again, we'll show the map up in the edit for those on the YouTube that can see exactly where this is and the sections of the Keystone Pipeline. Now, the XL is kind of like a shortcut from Canada down to Steel City, Nebraska. And it's like it kind of like cuts over, and it's a wider pipe. So it's an addition onto an already existing pipeline system, the Keystone system. So this addition is what is being protested the most, and Obama stalled the acceptance of the permit to build the addition, which is interesting because people were calling for it to be denied or shut down. Obama stalled it. It's interesting that he kind of like passed the problem to the next administration. Hillary Clinton in her running said that she would oppose the Keystone XL pipeline. Take her word for whatever it means to you. But then Trump now, who's in the next administration following Obama, obviously he's accepted the permit. But the actual pipeline is not, like the XL edition has not been completed yet. So we're still in those like preliminary permit and getting started phases. So that brings us to now that Native American tribes, this is last year in 2018, have filed a lawsuit against the government to invalidate the Keystone XL pipeline, or against TransCanada, and they want the Keystone to reapply for the permit. And so it's interesting to see that, we're getting to legal battles now. It's not just like a headline with, people protesting with signs and people hashtagging Instagram. It's real. This is a real, to the native peoples, they're gonna fight the legal battle because this is their land that they're fighting for.
Yeah, it is interesting that it's gone on to the courts now, and I think they might have a valid case because it does seem to violate sovereign Native American land, and you could even argue potentially it's a health issue, since a spill could potentially leak large amounts into the water surplus, and just many other public health issues. And so I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes, because like that Reuters article I cited earlier was saying, if they have to reapply for the permit, I'm not sure if they would get it again, because they've already violated many aspects of the permit. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to go. And it's interesting. You were talking about Obama, how it does seem somewhat like he pushed it on to the next administration, which seems to happen in a lot of politics. But to me, it was interesting because actually in 2013, a Pew Center public opinion poll says that about 65% of Americans favored the project. Majorities of men, women, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And it's actually interesting now, since then, in 2017, only 42% of Americans support it. And so there has been a large decline. So to me, it's fascinating that Trump still has gone so gung-ho in pushing it forward, because it's actually relatively unpopular right now. And so it's interesting how public opinions change, but the Trump administration's definitely gone full into it. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see where this goes with this, but I'm not really sure if they're going to be able to stop it at this point.
Yeah, yes, I think that's right. I think unfortunately that like the Trump administration, they probably wanted to go through, oil interests bet heavily on pro-business candidates, Democrat or Republican, and Trump is a pro-business candidate. So, there's probably special interests involved. In fact, I could almost guarantee there's special interests involved. I think you did have an interesting point about like how they've already broken parts of the permit. It might come down to like the actual fine print of like, look, like we can't do it with this kind of, you can't do this exact permit again. I also think it's interesting that from the Native Americans suing, following the lawsuit, they're citing that there was no, and the past permits that were given out, there was no analysis of treaty rights, no analysis of potential impact on hunting and fishing rights, and no analysis on the potential impacts of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe's unique water system. And then they also cite past treaties and environment and acts. So it'd be there's no analysis of the impact on cultural sites, which violates the Natural Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. So they're pointing out exactly where they think these violations come from. I'm interested to see where that lawsuit goes. But I think that brings me to the next part of the discussion is, how going forward, how do you build infrastructure, whether it be oil lines or high freeways or whatever, as well as respect the cultures that still inhabit these places, especially the native peoples. I think one is first of all, you have to abide by these acts, the National Environmental Policy Act, National Historic Preservation Act. You need to do analysis of the impact your building does on cultural sites as well as hunting grounds and fishing grounds, instead of ignore that completely. And then once you have a real analysis, right, and a third-party analysis, not like the oil company hired their buddy to do an analysis and says everything's A-okay, right? Like when you go to the mechanic or when you go to buy a used car and the guy's like, I'll get one of my buddy mechanics to check it out. And you're like, no. Let's get a different mechanic because I want someone that's going to tell me what's real. So something like that. But then on top of that, like, I think that we Native Americans and Indigenous peoples need to be at the table for these things. They need to be in the meeting with the oil company and the president or the governor of the state to have a say. because you could have kind of a middle ground where if a company wants to build a freeway in native lands, part of the state tax that goes to infrastructure will go to the native peoples as well, or you hire a certain part of the native peoples to do some of the work, so there's an economic benefit. But they need to be at the table for these things and treated like a sovereign nation that we supposedly claim they are.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, and this sovereign nation idea it really fascinates me, because when you look at the definition of a sovereign nation, it's a nation that can, make its own decisions and has decision making abilities in the region, and that is not what these Native American tribes are treated like,
Right.
And I just think, because I full-heartedly agree with you that, if we need to build a highway through potentially a sacred land or whatnot, I think there needs to be a middle ground and a discussion on both sides of how can we make this happen, but how can we also respect your history. But again, the problem is, like I said earlier, is I think that most Americans just have no regard or knowledge of this, and quite frankly, probably don't care.
Yeah.
Because when you talk about this sacred land and Native American traditions, it's like all this was happening before any of us were around, and there's no education on what any of this could be. We think of Judeo-Christian values, and our, like, to a lot of Americans, churches are sacred, but a giant mountain in out in the Midwest is not considered sacred to a lot of people. And I think it would just be hard to justify, oh, we're not going to build a pipeline here because some Native Americans call it sacred. I just think, and I'm not saying I agree with that, but I think that's where a lot of Americans would say, well, who cares,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, it's just, and I think that's why I enjoy covering this like so much, is because I do think that it's not really on the radar for a lot of people. Like you said, like our education system, yeah, you might learn about the Trail of Tears, and that might be, it's tragic, but like if you learn just that in history, a lot of people are like, yeah, well, that was hundreds of years ago, right, and whatever, and like it's not like that now. And I just think that a lot of people, just native issues in the United States and Canada are just not on people's radars. And again, it's hard to have the cultural context and understanding when you have a very different education and upbringing and everything. And then, that being said, of course, we do live in a reality where we have to build infrastructure and we have to figure out ways to become energy independent. And so, there's definitely real realities. Like, we're going to come, like, the Keystone is not the end. No matter what happens with this lawsuit, there's going to be some other pipeline or another freeway or another development. I mean, it doesn't even have to be dirty energy. It could be a solar farm in the future. Like, it's going to happen again and again, where we're going to have to run into how much do we want to build and progress as far as technology, and how much does that intrude on cultures that hold things sacred, and like how do we interact with those things. It's going to be very complicated, but I think that's the real point, is it's very complicated, and it's very touchy because you're dealing with cultures that many people don't understand, including myself. So I just think that the first thing is that they have to be at the table, and really at the table, not at the back of the table and not at the kiddie table. I think Native peoples have to be at the table in the same chairs as the U.S. government and whatever businesses are doing business.
Yeah, and I think that's very well said. They need to be running the table, especially if it's involving their rights and sovereignty. But so this is kind of a rhetorical question, but like, do you think it would be more productive to I don't know how it would be done, but like to get more Native Americans involved in, say, in the U.S. government, say in Congress, the Senate, whatnot, or do you think it would be better to have more independent bodies that work with the U.S. government? Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you think it'd be better if there are more Native Americans represented inside our own Congress, or if there was an external body that worked alongside the Congress?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. Now I think about it, maybe you have, again, these are just ideas that are just coming to my head now, so I'm sure they're full of flaws. But you could have, right, like the larger nations, like the Lakota and like the Navajo. You could have them have maybe a seat at Congress, right? Maybe they have, the representative from the Navajo Nation, and it has a little D or an R or whatever party. But, you could have an actual congressional representative, or you could have, perhaps, if they, again, I don't blame anyone for having a distrust of the U.S. government if you're a Native person. So if that's something that's like maybe not less than ideal, you could have like their own committee, right, with their own leaders that sets up to like, and then you have like a congressional committee that does transportation have to have like an impact report and discuss it with the Native American committee. I'm not, again, I'm just throwing out ideas, but I think you bring up a good point. Is perhaps I think the suggestion is that Native Americans need to have more representation in our government, and I just don't know what that would look like. I think ideally it would be like a congressman and a senator, but then again, you're kind of imposing the American political system onto perhaps the people that don't want it. So
Exactly, yeah, and I think also the problem is that our electoral system wouldn't really permit, or it'd be very difficult to always guarantee that Native Americans would get elected into office. You know what I mean? Because
right,
say you have 2 senators in North Dakota, it'd be very hard to say, oh, well, we're going to just hope that every time one of them is a Native American, and so that's why part of me thinks an external committee could be better, because if they are a sovereign nation, as they are called legally, maybe they do deserve to just have their own committee that works obviously inside the United States, but is always guaranteed a voice at the table, because it's like political mindsets change, but their blood doesn't change. There's always going to be a need for representation of Native Americans, and it's easier to now have Black and Mexican senators, because there's just so many more in so many large metropolitan areas. But to always guarantee representation of Native Americans is tough unless you almost mandate there be a committee or a seat,
right, or
and then
or have a congressional district that's just sovereign Native land.
Exactly, yeah, and that's tough, because then you would almost say then it's almost like going against how our whole system is made, though. Then at the same point, so it's like it like you said, it'd be very complicated. I don't know. It just something needs to be done, though.
Right. I mean, just for people that don't know, there is a federal agency called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but it's not like run by Native peoples. It's just they oversee the various agreements and stuff with sovereign nations and especially smaller reservations where they have to use like local police force from the other county and stuff. It gets complicated. And then there's also a whole system of how do I get you Native benefits and identify as Native. There's a blood quantum level. It's very complicated. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is backlogged, it's underfunded, it's complicated, and it's very contentious. So there's a lot of things that I think people don't realize that go into being a native of the United States and what that means as far as the relationship with the U.S. government. I do wanted to mention, though, that I think it's worth mentioning because we're talking about representation in government, that the Native Americans as a demographic in the United States since 9/11 have 19% of Native Americans have served in the armed forces. This is from Military Times, compared to the average of 14% for all other ethnicities. So there's a higher propensity to serve in the U.S. military as a Native American, and I think a lot of people forget that because there's so much rhetoric around, right? Like, this is an extreme example, right? This is just an anecdote, but there's just a funny thing where these Native Americans were like protesting something near the heads of the presidents. What's that called? Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore. There was a protest around Mount Rushmore, and someone took a picture of him and said, "Why don't you go back to your country? Like, we don't need you here." And it was like, dude, like these are Native Americans. Like, they are in their country. So I just thought that was an interesting, like, rhetorical thing that people still see Native Americans as kind of the other, like outside of the American system, where I think it's the military service is an example of, these Native Americans are just as American as anyone else, but there also is that extra layer of the sovereign land that we need to address.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It kind of makes you wonder, like, these are people that have kind of been the butt of a lot of government policies and health concerns and whatnot, and they're still fighting for their country. It's pretty remarkable to me that a lot of people could see them as the other, but if it was a Native American or myself, it's probably more statistically likely that they are going to serve and not me. You know what I mean? So it is fascinating, and I just really have to feel just horrible because I'm kind of interested in Indigenous history, like of all the Americas, North and South America, and I mean, the history is so vibrant and the culture is so fascinating, and there's just so much we don't know because of how much we destroyed early on. Like I think a lot of people wish that we could go back to the the late 1700s, early 1800s, and maybe have not destroyed as much as we did. And it was same in Central and South America. If there's so much that we could probably learn about where we live, because these people have been here much longer than us. And
Yeah, and it's important to remember that within human history, it wasn't that long ago that these terrible things in colonialism happened. So like for the average person, you and me, we grow up in middle America with a pretty normal childhood. It's like we don't even think about some of the massive cultural destruction that happened not that long ago. Whereas to someone else, it's like, look, it's only a few grandparents ago that we've gone from having a complete and like full vibrant language that everyone speaks to now there's only 3 people in the world that speak this language and it's dying off. I don't have experiences like that because it's like, yeah, everyone in my family spoke English and we will continue to. So it's just like, yeah, I think again that whole idea of it's not on really people's radar, and it's not if you're listening and it hasn't been on your radar, that's understandable because there's a lot of factors that go into why it's not on people's radars. It's not like I don't think it's a lot of people's fault per se, right? Because of education where you grew up and stuff, but I think it's now that it's becoming an issue again in the news a little bit with the pipeline. It's a good time to look at some of these issues and be like, well, how much don't I know about indigenous rights and cultural conflicts and stuff?
Yeah, it's somewhat interesting that we are trying to reconcile and move on so much from slavery. Like the things that we have done since the mid 19th century. Like it seems like most Americans are really trying to work past our dark history of slavery, but still our history of manifest destiny is something just less people acknowledge or talk about. I think it's that thing that everyone knows. Like if you talk to most people, I mean, everyone knows how bad we were to the Native Americans and how we technically wiped out just mass cultures. But it's something that we don't really talk about. It's that elephant in the room. I've seen it more being in Europe, talking to people, because Europeans will always mention the Native Americans and what the United States did to them, but Americans don't really talk about it, and I think maybe that's why America's been able to move past slavery in most parts decently well in the last 40 years or so, is because I think we're starting to just acknowledge it, and you kind of have to accept something's there before you can move past it. And with Native Americans, we really haven't.
Yeah, first of all, yeah, you have to acknowledge it, right? Ignoring history means the same thing will happen again. You have to look at history as a lesson, and I also and yeah, I think you're right. Like I learned about the Trail of Tears growing up. I don't think everyone learns about that. I learned about it in my public but well-funded West Coast high school. So I don't know if that's average for the average American kid. But even if you do, like, let's say you learn about all the terrible things that happened in the past and the Trail of Tears and all the terrible things about slavery that happened in the past. I still think you're missing the context of how that still affects people today. Right? What is that? What has that led to today? So yeah, we don't, the state of California doesn't pay people for Indian scalps anymore. Thank God. That's barbaric. But there's still plenty of indigenous issues going on in California today. Like you said earlier, people don't even realize when they're near native land, right? Like there's casinos all over California, but gambling in California is illegal. And people don't realize that because it's like, well, there's a casino right there. Like, yeah, but that's on native land. That's not California. So, and it's right in people's faces and they don't even realize that. Sometimes. So yeah, again, it's like you can even learn how bad Manifest Destiny was in the past, but I still think that a lot of people miss like what's still happening today. Like what are the issues today going on?
Yeah, there's quite a lot, and I I think that's a good point. Is I was from near Nevada on the California side, and as kids, if we wanted to buy fireworks or something, we would go to the Native American land to buy fireworks.
Right.
Or yeah, when we were going to school down at Chapman, I went once to it's like it's stuff like that. Unfortunately, I think it's that stigma is what doesn't help it. It's just like they have casinos and their laws are different, but they're still. It almost feels like they're with us but separate. Like it's kind of a weird feeling of like it's okay, cool. It's a casino. It's a shop that sells fireworks when the shop down the street doesn't. But it's like that's like I feel like it's just a separate but unequal kind of feeling.
Yeah, I definitely I understand that idea, right? It's just like, oh, look, it's just like they get to have casinos, right? And it's like that. There's so many more layers to it, and like it's not just the difference is not just like a couple laws. Like it might be visible to people, but I think there's a lot of invisible differences that native people that live on these lands surely know, but the people around them or the people not familiar with them don't realize, like the blood quantum levels, how to prove you're a Native American
Yeah.
to the U.S. government. Like that's a very weird, strange thing to do. You have to send in blood quantum levels. Like what the hell? Like people, half the people have never even heard of that.
It's so true.
Yeah, there's a lot of invisible differences that I think people don't realize. So I'm glad we were able to bring some attention to this. It's obviously a complex issue, and we'll see what happens with this lawsuit. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was looking through my notes and I just forgot to say this, which I think is a problem too to this. Like, because we've been talking about how to try to bring Native Americans to the table. And of course, Trump, like he's done with a lot of things, always trying to reverse Obama era decisions. But the Wampanoag tribe, I apologize already for probably butchering that, have been fighting over their sovereignty since the 1770s. And of course, Trump reversed their recognition. And it's like stuff like that just doesn't need to happen in this day and age.
Yeah.
I don't know if we need to start reversing recognition of people that have been here long before us, and so I think it all starts at the top again. And obviously this administration, I mean, I wouldn't say they don't like Native Americans, but it doesn't seem to be in their agenda to help them either. And so I mean, I think it's hard when you have the executive branch not doing anything good for it either, so. And the second thing I just wanted to say was funny, like to kind of an update on what we were talking about last week. This leaves the United States a little bit, but Bolivia. We were talking about Evo Morales last week, and Foreign Policy had an interesting article today that was talking about how his removal or withdrawal or whatever you want to call it, or coup, still debate, was actually a huge blow for Indigenous rights worldwide. And it was just kind of an interesting look about how if he was gotten rid of by more of a coup, it's a bad look for Indigenous rights, especially in South America, because he was kind of a figurehead for trying to bring them to the table. And now it looks like they'll probably go backwards. And so, I mean, I think worldwide, it kind of just illustrates that a lot of Indigenous people are having issues. I mean, Canada's done better recently, but still, I mean, other parts of the world, you really have severe issues with Indigenous rights. And so I think Evo Morales, for example, he might have been flawed, but I think we need more Indigenous leaders around the world.
Yeah, especially in Latin America, where Latin America, they've the whole backseat problem, like for so long they've not even been at the table at all. I think you're right. Again, Evo Morales is definitely a flawed leader, but who isn't? But it probably is a blow for Indigenous people. I mean, they finally got someone to get to that echelon and that level of government and representation, and now he's gone, and he's kind of gone in a disgraceful manner, and it's like that's a shame. That's a damn shame for everyone around. I do have I don't know. I guess I do have some more hope that I think, at least in America, the younger cultures are being more somewhat of aware of cultural differences and being more accepting of cultures. I'm trying to find some kind of silver lining.
Yeah.
So hopefully that'll continue, and that'll be a trend that people respect other cultures and try to put your shoes on, or what's the saying? Spend a day in someone else's shoes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Walk a mile in someone's shoes or something like that, I think. So it's a good point. It's just been interesting for me being in Spain, because in the U.S., obviously, in the last 15 years, we've really turned on Columbus.
Yeah.
and Indigenous Peoples Day, and kind of changing the narrative of him being a hero and an explorer. But it's funny, in Spain they still have a Columbus, a big celebration, and most Spanish people still think he's important. And it's kind of caused me to look at it from an open mind and think, there's figures like him that if he didn't do it, someone else would have.
Yeah.
But it is too bad that, I mean, it goes back to what we've been talking about this whole time, is that people put him as a historical figure, and we learned about how he discovered America. We didn't really learn about what happened along with that.
Hey, the Vikings did it first, apparently, or something like that. I don't know all the details. I heard that on a YouTube video once. All right, guys. Well, thank you again for tuning into the Tonic Accord podcast. It's been a fascinating episode. Again, as always, please comment and let us know your thoughts. Is this something that you've thought about before? Is there something that we missed that you want to add? Let us know in the comments of the YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcast, Facebook, Instagram. Yeah, I mean, if you send us an Instagram DM, slide into our DMs with a concern or a question. We want to hear it. So let us know, guys, and thank you again.